Section 14 of Short Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Crocodile, An Extraordinary Incident, Part 4. The monkeys I dreamed about, I surmise, because they were shut up in the case at the Germans, but Elena Ivanovna was a different story. I may as well say at once, I loved the lady, but I make haste, post-haste, to make a qualification. I loved her as a father, neither more nor less. I judged that because I often felt an irresistible desire to kiss her little head or her rosy cheek. And, though I never carried out this inclination, I would not have refused even to kiss her lips. And not merely her lips, but her teeth, which always gleamed so charmingly like 2 rows of pretty, well-matched pearls when she laughed. She laughed extraordinarily often. Ivan Matveitch in demonstrative moments used to call her his darling absurdity, a name extremely happy and appropriate. She was a perfect sugar plum, and that was all one could say of her. Therefore I am utterly at a loss to understand what possessed Ivan Matveitch to imagine his wife as a Russian Yevgenia Tor. Anyway, my dream, with the exception of the monkeys, left the most pleasant impression upon me. In going over all the incidents of the previous day as I drank my morning cup of tea, I resolved to go and see Elena Ivanovna at once on my way to the office, which indeed I was bound to do as the friend of the family. In a tiny little room out of the bedroom, the so-called little drawing-room, though their big drawing-room was little too, Elena Ivanovna was sitting, in some half-transparent morning wrapper, on a smart little sofa before a little tea table, drinking coffee out of a little cup in which she was dipping a minute biscuit. She was ravishingly pretty, but struck me as being at the same time rather pensive.
"Ah, that's you, naughty man,"
she said, greeting me with an absent-minded smile.
"Sit down, Featherhead. Have some coffee. Well, what were you doing yesterday? Were you at the masquerade?"
"Why, were you? I don't go, you know. Besides, yesterday I was visiting our captive." I sighed and assumed a pious expression as I took the coffee.
"Whom? What captive? Oh, yes, poor fellow. Well, how is he? Bored? Do you know, I wanted to ask you, I suppose I can ask for a divorce now?"
"A divorce?" I cried in indignation and almost spilled the coffee. "It's that swarthy fellow," I thought to myself bitterly. There was a certain swarthy gentleman with little moustaches who was something in the architectural line, and who came far too often to see them, and was extremely skillful in amusing Elena Ivanovna. I must confess I hated him, and there was no doubt that he had succeeded in seeing Elena Ivanovna yesterday, either at the masquerade or even here, and putting all sorts of nonsense into her head.
"Why,"
Elena Ivanovna rattled off hurriedly, as though it were a lesson she had learnt,
"if he is going to stay on in the Crocodile, perhaps not come back all his life, while I sit waiting for him here? A husband ought to live at home, and not in a crocodile."
"But this was an unforeseen occurrence," I was beginning in very comprehensible agitation.
"Oh, no, don't talk to me. I won't listen. I won't listen,"
she cried, suddenly getting quite cross.
"You are always against me. You wretch. There's no doing anything with you. You will never give me any advice. Other people tell me that I can get a divorce because Ivan Matveitch will not get his salary now."
"Elena Ivanovna, is it you I hear?" I exclaimed pathetically. "What villain could have put such an idea into your head? And divorce on such a trivial ground as a salary is quite impossible. And poor Ivan Matveitch is, so to speak, burning with love for you, even in the bowels of the monster. What's more, he is melting away with love like a lump of sugar. Yesterday, while you were enjoying yourself at the masquerade, he was saying that he might in the last resort send for you as his lawful spouse, to join him in the entrails of the monster, especially as it appears the crocodile is exceedingly roomy, not only able to accommodate 2, but even 3 persons. And then I told her all that interesting part of my conversation the night before with Ivan Matveitch.
What? She cried in surprise. You want me to get into that monster too? To be with Ivan Matveitch? What an idea! And how am I to get in there? In my hat and crinoline? Heavens, what foolishness! And what should I look like while I was getting into it? And very likely there would be someone there to see me. It's absurd. And what should I have to eat there? And what should I do there when... Oh, my goodness, what will they think of next? And what should I have to amuse me there? You say there's a smell of gutta percha? And what should I do if we quarreled? Should we have to go on staying there side by side? Phoo, how horrid!
I agree with all those arguments, my sweet Elena Ivanovna. I interrupted, striving to express myself with that natural enthusiasm which always overtakes a man when he feels the truth is on his side. But one thing you have not appreciated in all this. You have not realized that he cannot live without you if he is inviting you there. That is a proof of love. Passionate, faithful, ardent love. You have thought too little of his love, dear Elena Ivanovna.
I won't hear anything about it.
Waving me off with her pretty little hand with glistening pink nails that had just been washed and polished.
Horrid man, you will reduce me to tears. Get into it yourself if you like the prospect. You are his friend. Get in and keep him company, and spend your life discussing some tedious science.
You are wrong to laugh at this suggestion. I checked the frivolous woman with dignity. Ivan Matveitch has invited me as it is. You, of course, are summoned there by duty. For me it would be an act of generosity. But when Ivan Matveitch described to me last night the elasticity of the crocodile, he hinted very plainly that there would be room not only for you two, but for me also as a friend of the family, especially if I wished to join you, and therefore...
How so? The 3 of us?
Cried Elena Ivanovna, looking at me in surprise.
Why, how should we? Are we going to be all 3 there together? How silly you both are! I shall certainly pinch you all the time, you wretch!
And falling back on the sofa, she laughed till she cried. All this, the tears and the laughter, were so fascinating that I could not resist rushing eagerly to kiss her hand, which she did not oppose, though she did pinch my ears lightly as a sign of reconciliation. Then we both grew very cheerful, and I described to her in detail all Ivan Matveitch's plans. The thought of her evening receptions and her salon pleased her very much.
Only I should need a great many new dresses, she observed, and so Ivan Matveitch must send me as much of his salary as possible, and as soon as possible. Only, I don't know about that.
She added thoughtfully,
How can he be brought here in the tank? That's very absurd. I don't want my husband to be carried about in a tank. I should feel quite ashamed for my visitors to see it. I don't want that. No, I don't.
By the way, while I think of it, was Timothy Semyonich here yesterday?
Oh, yes, he was. He came to comfort me. And do you know, we played cards all the time. He played for sweetmeats, and if I lost he was to kiss my hands. What a wretch he is! And only fancy, he almost came to the masquerade with me. Really.
He was carried away by his feelings, I observed. And who would not be with you, you charmer?
Oh, get along with your compliments. Stay, I'll give you a pinch as a parting present. I've learnt to pinch awfully well lately. Well, what do you say to that? By the way, you say Ivan Matveitch spoke several times of me yesterday?
No, not exactly. I must say he is thinking more now of the fate of humanity, and once—
Oh, let him. You needn't go on. I am sure it's fearfully boring. I'll go and see him sometime. I shall certainly go tomorrow. Only not today. I've got a headache. And besides, there will be such a lot of people there today. They'll say, "That's his wife," and I shall feel ashamed. Goodbye. You will be there this evening, won't you?
To see him, yes. He asked me to go and take him the papers.
That's capital. Go and read to him, but don't come and see me today. I am not well, and perhaps I may go and see someone. Goodbye, you naughty man.
It's that swarthy fellow is going to see her this evening, I thought. At the office, of course, I gave no sign of being consumed by these cares and anxieties, but soon I noticed some of the most progressive papers seemed to be passing particularly rapidly from hand to hand among my colleagues, and were being read with an extremely serious expression of face. The first one that reached me was the news sheet, a paper of no particular party, but humanitarian in general, for which it was regarded with contempt among us, though it was read. Not without surprise, I read in it the following paragraph. Yesterday, strange rumors were circulating among the spacious ways and sumptuous buildings of our vast metropolis. A certain well-known bon vivant of the highest society, probably weary of the cuisine at Borel's and at the X Club, went into the arcade, into the place where an immense crocodile recently brought to the metropolis is being exhibited, and insisted on its being prepared for his dinner. After bargaining with the proprietor, he at once set to work to devour him. That is, not the proprietor, a very meek and punctilious German, but his crocodile, cutting juicy morsels with his penknife from the living animal and swallowing them with extraordinary rapidity. By degrees, the whole crocodile disappeared into the vast recesses of his stomach, so that he was even on the point of attacking an ichneumon, a constant companion of the crocodile, probably imagining that the latter would be as savory. We are by no means opposed to that new article of diet with which foreign gourmands have long been familiar. We have indeed predicted that it would come. English lords and travellers make up regular parties for catching crocodiles in Egypt, and consume the back of the monster cooked like beefsteak, with mustard, onions, and potatoes. The French who followed in the train of Lesseps prefer the paws baked in hot ashes, which they do, however, in opposition to the English, who laugh at them. Probably both ways would be appreciated among us. For our part, we are delighted at a new branch of industry, of which our great and varied fatherland stands preeminently in need. Probably before a year is out, crocodiles will be brought in hundreds to replace this first one, lost in the stomach of a Petersburg gourmand. And why should not the crocodile be acclimatized among us in Russia? If the water of the Neva is too cold for these interesting strangers, there are ponds in the capital and rivers and lakes outside it. Why not breed crocodiles at Pargolovo, for instance, or at Pavlovsk in the Presnensky ponds, and in Samoteka in Moscow, while providing agreeable, wholesome nourishment for our fastidious gourmands? They might at the same time entertain the ladies who walk about these ponds and instruct the children in natural history. The crocodile skin might be used for making jewel cases, boxes, cigar cases, pocketbooks, and possibly more than 1,000 saved up in the greasy notes that are peculiarly beloved of merchants might be laid by in the crocodile skin. We hope to return more than once to this interesting topic. Though I had foreseen something of the sort, yet the reckless inaccuracy of the paragraph overwhelmed me. Finding no one with whom to share my impression, I turned to Prohor Savitch, who was sitting opposite to me, and noticed that the latter had been watching me for some time, while in his hand he held the Voice, as though he were on the point of passing it to me. Without a word, he took the news sheet from me, and as he handed me the Voice, he drew a line with his nail against an article, to which he probably wished to call my attention. This Prohor Savage was a very queer man, a taciturn old bachelor. He was not on intimate terms with any of us, scarcely spoke to anyone in the office, always had an opinion of his own about everything, but could not bear to import it to anyone. He lived alone. Hardly anyone among us had ever been in his lodging. This was what I read in the Voice. Everyone knows that we are progressive and humanitarian and want to be on a level with Europe in this respect. But in spite of all our exertions and the efforts of our paper, we are still far from maturity, as may be judged from the shocking incident which took place yesterday in the arcade, and which we predicted long ago. A foreigner arrives in the capital, bringing with him a crocodile which he begins exhibiting in the arcade. We immediately hasten to welcome a new branch of useful industry, such as our powerful and varied fatherland stands in great need of. Suddenly, yesterday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a gentleman of exceptional stoutness enters the foreigner's shop in an intoxicated condition, pays his entrance money, and immediately, without any warning, leaps into the jaws of the crocodile, who was forced, of course, to swallow him, if only from an instinct of self-preservation, to avoid being crushed. Tumbling into the inside of the crocodile, the stranger at once dropped asleep. Neither the shouts of the foreign proprietor, nor the lamentations of his terrified family, nor threats to send for the police made the slightest impression. Within the crocodile was heard nothing but laughter and a promise to flay him. Though the poor animal, compelled to swallow such a mass, was vainly shedding tears. An uninvited guest is worse than a Tartar, but in spite of the proverb, the insolent visitor would not leave. We do not know how to explain such barbarous incidents which prove our lack of culture and disgrace us in the eyes of foreigners. The recklessness of the Russian temperament has found a fresh outlet. It may be asked what was the object of the uninvited visitor. A warm and comfortable abode? But there are many excellent houses in the capital with very cheap and comfortable lodgings, with the Neva water laid on and a staircase lighted by gas, frequently with a hall porter maintained by the proprietor. We would call our readers' attention to the barbarous treatment of domestic animals. It is difficult, of course, for the crocodile to digest such a mass all at once, and now he lies swollen out to the size of a mountain, awaiting death in insufferable agonies. In Europe, persons guilty of inhumanity towards domestic animals have long been punished by laws, but in spite of our European enlightenment, in spite of our European pavements, in spite of the European architecture of our houses, we are still far from shaking off our time-honored traditions. Though the houses are new, the conventions are old. And indeed, the houses are not new. At least the staircases in them are not. We have more than once in our paper alluded to the fact that in the Petersburg side, in the house of the merchant Lukyanov, the steps of the wooden staircase have decayed, fallen away, and have long been a danger for Efimya Skapidorov, a soldier's wife who works in the house, and is often obliged to go up the stairs with water or armfuls of wood. At last our predictions have come true. Yesterday evening, at 8:30, Efimya Skapidorov fell down with a basin of soup and broke her leg. We do not know whether Lukyanov will mend his staircase now. Russians are often wise after the event, but the victim of Russian carelessness has by now been taken to the hospital. In the same way, we shall never cease to maintain that the house porters who clear away the mud from the wooden pavement in the Vyborgsky side ought not to splatter the legs of passers-by, but should throw the mud up into heaps, as is done in Europe. And so on and so on. "What's this?" I asked in some perplexity, looking at Prohor Savage. "What's the meaning of it?" "How do you mean?" "Why, upon my word, instead of pitying Ivan Matveitch, they pity the crocodile." "What of it? They have pity even for a beast, a mammal. We must be up to Europe, mustn't we? They have a very warm feeling for crocodiles there, too. Saying this, queer old pro-horse Savage dived into his papers, and would not utter another word. I stuffed the Voice and the news sheet into my pocket, and collected as many old copies of the newspapers as I could find, for Ivan Matveitch's diversion in the evening, and though the evening was far off, yet on this occasion I slipped away from the office early to go to the arcade and look, if only from a distance, at what was going on there, and to listen to the various remarks and currents of opinion. I foresaw that there would be a regular crush there, and turned up the collar of my coat to meet it. I somehow felt rather shy. So unaccustomed are we to publicity, but I feel that I have no right to report my own prosaic feelings when faced with this remarkable and original incident. End of The Crocodile by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Reading by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 15 of Short Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bobok. From somebody's diary. Semyon Ardalyonovitch said to me all of a sudden the day before yesterday, "Why, will you ever be sober, Ivan Ivanovitch? Tell me that, pray." A strange requirement. I did not resent it. I am a timid man. But here they have actually made me out mad. An artist painted my portrait as it happened. "After all, you are a literary man," he said. I submitted. He exhibited it. I read, "Go and look at that morbid face suggesting insanity." It may be so, but think of putting it so bluntly into print. In print, everything ought to be decorous. There ought to be ideals, while, instead of that... Say it indirectly, at least. That's what you have style for. But no, he doesn't care to do it indirectly. Nowadays, humor and a fine style have disappeared, and abuse is accepted as wit. I do not resent it, but God knows I am not enough of a literary man to go out of my mind. I have written a novel. It has not been published. I have written articles. They have been refused. Those articles I took about from one editor to another. Everywhere they refused them. "You have no salt," they told me. "What sort of salt do you want?" I asked with a jeer. "Attic salt?" They did not even understand. For the most part, I translate from the French for the booksellers. I write advertisements for shopkeepers, too. Unique opportunity. Fine tea from our own plantations. I made a nice little sum over a panegyric on his deceased Excellency Pyotr Matveitch. I compiled the Art of Pleasing the Ladies, a commission from a bookseller. I have brought out some 6 little works of this kind in the course of my life. I am thinking of making a collection of the bon mots of Voltaire, but am afraid it may seem a little flat to our people. Voltaire's no good now. Nowadays we want a cudgel, not Voltaire. We knock each other's last teeth out nowadays. Well, so that's the whole extent of my literary activity. Though, indeed, I do send round letters to the editors gratis and fully signed. I give them all sorts of counsels and admonitions, criticize and point out the true path. The letter I sent last week to an editor's office was the 40th I had sent in the last 2 years. I have wasted 4 rubles over stamps alone for them. My temper is at the bottom of it all. I believe that the artist who painted me did so not for the sake of literature, but for the sake of 2 symmetrical warts on my forehead. A natural phenomenon, he would say. They have no ideas, so now they are out for phenomena. And didn't he succeed in getting my warts in his portrait? To the life. That is what they call realism. And as to madness, a great many people were put down as mad among us last year, and in such language, with such original talent. And yet, after all, it appears, However, one ought to have foreseen it long ago. That is rather artful, so that from the point of view of pure art, one may really commend it. Well, but after all, these so-called madmen have turned out cleverer than ever. So it seems the critics can call them mad, but they cannot produce anyone better. The wisest of all, in my opinion, is he who can, if only once a month, call himself a fool, a faculty unheard of nowadays. In old days, once a year at any rate, a fool would recognize that he was a fool. But nowadays, not a bit of it. And they have so muddled things up that there is no telling a fool from a wise man. They have done that on purpose. I remember a witty Spaniard saying when, 250 years ago, the French built their first madhouses, "They have shut up all their fools in a house apart, to make sure that they are wise men themselves." Just so. You don't show your own wisdom by shutting someone else in a madhouse. K has gone out of his mind means that we are sane now. No, it doesn't mean that yet. Hang it, though. Why am I maundering on? I go on grumbling and grumbling. Even my maidservant is sick of me. Yesterday a friend came to see me. "Your style is changing," he said. "It is choppy. You chop, and then a parenthesis in the parenthesis. Then you stick in something else in brackets. Then you begin chopping and chopping again." The friend is right. Something strange is happening to me. My character is changing, and my head aches. I am beginning to see and hear strange things. Not voices exactly, but as though someone beside me were muttering, "Bobok, Bobok, Bobok." What's the meaning of this Bobok? I must divert my mind. I went out in search of diversion. I hit upon a funeral. A distant relation, a collegiate counselor, however. A widow and 5 daughters, all marriageable young ladies. What must it come to even to keep them in slippers? Their father managed it, but now there is only a little pension. They will have to eat humble pie. They have always received me ungraciously. And indeed, I should not have gone to the funeral now had it not been for a peculiar circumstance. I followed the procession to the cemetery with the rest. They were stuck up and held aloof from me. My uniform was certainly rather shabby. It's 25 years, I believe, since I was at the cemetery. What a wretched place! To begin with, the smell. There were 15 hearses with palls varying in expensiveness. There were actually 2 catafalques. One was a general's and one some lady's. There were many mourners, a great deal of feigned mourning, and a great deal of open gaiety. The clergy have nothing to complain of. It brings them a good income. But the smell. I should not like to be one of the clergy here. I kept glancing at the faces of the dead cautiously, distrusting my impressionability. Some had a mild expression, some looked unpleasant. As a rule, the smiles were disagreeable, and in some cases very much so. I don't like them. They haunt one's dreams. During the service, I went out of the church into the air. It was a gray day, but dry. It was cold, too, but then it was October. I walked about among the tombs. They are of different grades. The 3rd grade cost 30 rubles. It's decent and not so very dear. The first 2 grades are tombs in the church and under the porch. They cost a pretty penny. On this occasion, they were burying in tombs of the 3rd grade 6 persons, among them the general and the lady. I looked into the graves, and it was horrible. Water, and such water! Absolutely green, but there, why talk of it? The gravedigger was bailing it out every minute. I went out while the service was going on and strolled outside the gates. Close by was an almshouse, and a little further off there was a restaurant. It was not a bad little restaurant. There was lunch and everything. There were lots of the mourners there. I noticed a great deal of gaiety and genuine heartiness. I had something to eat and drink. Then I took part in the bearing of the coffin from the church to the graveyard. Why is it that corpses in their coffins are so heavy? They say it is due to some sort of inertia, that the body is no longer directed by its owner, or some nonsense of that sort, in opposition to the laws of mechanics and common sense. I don't like to hear people who have nothing but a general education venture to solve the problems that require special knowledge. And with us that's done continually. Civilians love to pass opinions about subjects that are the province of the soldier and even of the field marshal, while men who have been educated as engineers prefer discussing philosophy and political economy. I did not go to the requiem service. I have some pride, and if I am only received owing to some special necessity, why force myself on their dinners, even if it be a funeral dinner? The only thing I don't understand is why I stayed at the cemetery. I sat on a tombstone and sank into appropriate reflections. I began with the Moscow exhibition and ended with reflecting upon astonishment in the abstract. My deductions about astonishment were these. To be surprised at everything is stupid, of course, and to be astonished at nothing is a great deal more becoming, and for some reason accepted as good form. But that is not really true. To my mind, to be astonished at nothing is much more stupid than to be astonished at everything, and moreover, to be astonished at nothing is almost the same as feeling respect for nothing, and indeed a stupid man is incapable of feeling respect. But what I desire most of all is to feel respect. I thirst to feel respect. One of my acquaintances said to me the other day, "He thirsts to feel respect." Goodness, I thought, what would happen to you if you dared to print that nowadays? At that point, I sank into forgetfulness. I don't like reading the epitaphs of tombstones. They are everlastingly the same. An unfinished sandwich was lying on the tombstone near me, stupid and inappropriate. I threw it on the ground, as it was not bread, but only a sandwich. Though I believe it is not a sin to throw bread on the earth, but only on the floor. I must look it up in Suveren's calendar. I suppose I sat there for a long time. Too long a time, in fact. I must have lain down on a long stone, which was of the shape of a marble coffin. And how it happened, I don't know. But I began to hear things of all sorts being said. At first, I did not pay attention to it, but treated it with contempt. But the conversation went on. I heard muffled sounds as though the speakers' mouths were covered with a pillow, and at the same time they were distinct and very near. I came to myself, sat up, and began listening attentively.
"Your Excellency, it's utterly impossible. You led hearts, I return your lead, and here you play the 7 of diamonds. You ought to have given me a hint about diamonds." "What? Play by hard and fast rules? Where is the charm of that?" "You must, Your Excellency. One can't do anything without something to go upon. We must play with dummy. Let one hand not be turned up." "Well, you won't find a dummy here."
What conceited words! And it was queer and unexpected. One was such a ponderous, dignified voice, the other softly suave. I should not have believed it if I had not heard it myself. I had not been to the requiem dinner, I believe. And yet, how could they be playing preference here, and what general was this? That the sounds came from under the tombstones, of that there could be no doubt. I bent down and read on the tomb, "Here lies the body of Major General Pervoyadev, a cavalier of such and such orders. Passed away in August of this year, 57. Rest beloved ashes till the joyful dawn. Dash it, it really is a general. There was no monument on the grave from which the obsequious voice came. There was only a tombstone. He must have been a fresh arrival. From his voice he was a lower court counselor." I heard a new voice a dozen yards from the general's resting place, coming from quite a fresh grave. The voice belonged to a man, and a plebeian, mawkish with its affectation of religious fervor.
"Oh, here he is hiccuping again!"
cried the haughty and disdainful voice of an irritated lady, apparently of the highest society.
"It is an affliction to be by this shopkeeper."
"I didn't hiccup, why, I've had nothing to eat. It's simply my nature. Really, madam, you don't seem to be able to get rid of your caprices here."
"Then why don't you come and lie down here?"
"They put me here. My wife and little children put me here. I did not lie down here of myself. The mystery of death, and I would not have lain down beside you, not for any money. I lay here as befitting my fortune, judging by the price, for we can always do that, pay for a tomb of the 3rd grade."
"You made money, I suppose? You fleeced people?"
"Fleece you indeed. We haven't seen the color of your money since January. There's a little bill against you at the shop."
"Well, that's really stupid. To try and recover debts here is too stupid, to my thinking. Go to the surface. Ask my niece. She is my heiress."
"There's no asking anyone now, and no going anywhere. We have both reached our limit, and before the judgment seat of God are equal in our sins."
"In our sins?"
The lady mimicked him contemptuously.
"Don't dare to speak to me."
You see, the shopkeeper obeys the lady, Your Excellency." "Why shouldn't he?" "Why, Your Excellency, because we all know things are different here." "Different? How?" "We are dead, so to speak, Your Excellency." "Oh, yes, but still—"
Well, this is an entertainment. It is a fine show, I must say. If it has come to this down here, what can one expect on the surface? But what a queer business. I went on listening, however, though with extreme indignation.
"Yes, I should like a taste of life. Yes, you know, I should like a taste of life."
I heard a new voice suddenly somewhere in the space between the general and the irritable lady.
"Do you hear, Your Excellency? Our friend is at the same game again. For 3 days at a time he says nothing, and then he bursts out with, 'I should like a taste of life. Yes, a taste of life. And with such an appetite. Hee." "And such frivolity." "It gets hold of him, Your Excellency. And do you know, he is growing sleepy, quite sleepy. He has been here since April, and then all of a sudden, 'I should like a taste of life.' It is rather dull, though,"
observed His Excellency.
"It is, Your Excellency. Shall we tease Avdotya Ignatyevna again? Hee." "No, spare me, please. I can't endure that quarrelsome virago."
"And I can't endure either of you,"
cried the virago disdainfully.
"You are both of you bores and can't tell me anything ideal. I know one little story about you, Your Excellency. Don't turn your nose up, please. How a manservant swept you out from under a married couple's bed one morning."
"Nasty woman,"
the general muttered through his teeth.
"Avdotya Ignatyevna, ma'am,"
the shopkeeper wailed suddenly again.
"My dear lady, don't be angry, but tell me, am I going through the ordeal by torment now, or is it something else?"
"Ah, he is at it again, as I expected, for there's a smell from him which means he is turning round."
"I am not turning round, madame, and there's no particular smell from me, for I've kept my body whole as it should be, while you're regularly high. For the smell is really horrible, even for a place like this. I don't speak of it merely from politeness."
"Ha! You horrid, insulting wretch! He positively stinks and talks about me."
"If only the time for my requiem would come quickly, I should hear their tearful voices over my head, my wife's lament, and my children's soft weeping."
"Well, that's a thing to fret for. They'll stuff themselves with funeral rice and go home. Oh, I wish somebody would wake up."
"Avdotya Ignatyevna,"
said the insinuating government clerk.
Wait a bit. The new arrivals will speak.
And are there any young people among them?
Yes, there are, Avdotya Ignatyevna. There are some not more than lads.
Oh, how welcome that would be.
Haven't they begun yet?
Inquired His Excellency.
Even those who came the day before yesterday haven't awakened yet, Your Excellency. As you know, they sometimes don't speak for a week. It's a good job that today and yesterday and the day before they brought a whole lot. As it is, they are all last year's for 70 feet round.
Yes, it will be interesting.
Yes, Your Excellency, they buried Tarasevich, the Privy Councillor, today. I knew it from the voices. I know his nephew. He helped to lower the coffin just now.
Where is he then?
5 steps from you, Your Excellency, on the left, almost at your feet. You should make his acquaintance, Your Excellency.
No, it's not for me to make advances.
Oh, he will begin of himself, Your Excellency. He will be flattered. Leave it to me, Your Excellency, and I...
Oh, what is happening to me?
Croaked the frightened voice of a new arrival.
A new arrival, Your Excellency, a new arrival. Thank God. And how quick he's been. Sometimes they don't say a word for a week.
Oh, I believe it's a young man.
Avdotya Ignatyevna cried shrilly.
It was a complication, and so sudden.
Faltered the young man again.
Only the evening before, Schultz said to me, "There's a complication," and I died suddenly before morning.
Well, there's no help for it, young man.
The general observed graciously, evidently pleased at a new arrival.
You must be comforted. You are kindly welcome to our Vale of Jehoshaphat, so to call it. We are kind-hearted people. You will come to know us and appreciate us. Major General Vasily Vasilich Pervoyedev, at your service.
Oh, no, certainly not. I was at Schultz's. I had a complication, you know. At first it was my chest and a cough, and then I caught a cold. My lungs an influenza, and all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly, the worst of all was its being so unexpected.
You say it began with the chest.
The government clerk put in suavely, as though he wished to reassure the new arrival.
Yes, my chest and catarrh, and then no catarrh, but still the chest, and I couldn't breathe, and you know.
I know, but if it was the chest, you ought to have gone to Ecke and not to Schultz.
You know, I kept meaning to go to Botkin's, and all at once...
Botkin is quite prohibitive,
observed the general.
Oh no, he is not forbidding at all. I've heard he is so attentive and foretells everything beforehand.
His Excellency was referring to his fees.
The government clerk corrected him.
Oh, not at all. He only has 3 rubles, and he makes such an examination and gives you a prescription. And I was very anxious to see him, for I have been told... Well, gentlemen, had I better go to Ecke or to Botkin?
What? To whom?
The general's corpse shook with agreeable laughter. The government clerk echoed it in falsetto.
Dear boy, dear delightful boy, how I love you.
Avdotya Ignatyevna squealed ecstatically.
I wish they had put someone like you next to me.
No, that was too much. And these were the dead of our times. Still, I ought to listen more and not be in too great a hurry to draw conclusions. That sniveling new arrival, I remember him just now in his coffin, had the expression of a frightened chicken, the most revolting expression in the world. However, let us wait and see. But what happened next was such a bedlam that I could not keep it all in my memory, for a great many woke up at once. An official, a civil councillor, woke up, and began discussing at once the project of a new subcommittee in the government department, and of the probable transfer of various functionaries in connection with the subcommittee, which very greatly interested the general. I must confess I learned a great deal that was new myself, so much so that I marveled at the channels by which one may, sometimes, in the metropolis learn government news. Then an engineer half woke up, but for a long time muttered absolute nonsense, so that our friends left off worrying him and let him lie till he was ready. At last, the distinguished lady who had been buried in the morning under the catafalque showed symptoms of the reanimation of the tomb. Lebeziatnikov, for the obsequious lower court councillor whom I detested and who lay beside General Pervoyadev was called, it appears, Lebeziatnikov, became much excited, and surprised that they were all waking up so soon this time. I must own I was surprised too, though some of those who had woke had been buried for 3 days, as, for instance, a very young girl of 16 who kept giggling in a horrible and predatory way.
Your Excellency, Privy Councillor Tarasevich is waking,
Lebeziatnikov announced with extreme fussiness.
Hey? What?
The Privy Councillor, waking up suddenly, mumbled with a lisp of disgust. There was a note of ill-humoured peremptoriness in the sound of his voice. I listened with curiosity, for during the last few days I had heard something about Tarasevich, shocking and upsetting in the extreme.
It's I, Your Excellency, so far only I. What is your petition? What do you want? Merely to inquire after Your Excellency's health. In these unaccustomed surroundings, everyone feels at first, as it were, oppressed. General Pervoyadev wishes to have the honor of making Your Excellency's acquaintance, and hopes... I've never heard of him. Surely, Your Excellency, General Pervoyadev Vasily Vasilich. Are you General Pervoyadev? No, Your Excellency, I am only the lower court councillor, Lebeziatnikov, at your service, but General Pervoyadev... Nonsense. And I beg you to leave me alone.
Let him be.
General Pervoyadev at last himself checked with dignity the disgusting officiousness of his sycophant in the grave.
He is not fully awake, Your Excellency. You must consider that. It's the novelty of it all. When he is fully awake, he will take it differently.
Let him be,
repeated the general.
Vasily Vasilich! Hey, Your Excellency!
A perfectly new voice shouted loudly and aggressively from close beside Avdotya Ignatyevna. It was a voice of gentlemanly insolence, with the languid pronunciation now fashionable and an arrogant drawl.
I've been watching you all for the last 2 hours. Do you remember me, Vasily Vasilich? My name is Klinovitz. We met at the Volonkanskys, where you, too, were received as a guest. I am sure I don't know why.
What, Count Pyotr Petrovitch? Can it be really you? And at such an early age? How sorry I am to hear it.
Oh, I am sorry myself, though I don't really mind, and I want to amuse myself as far as I can everywhere. And I am not a count, but a baron, only a baron. We are only a set of scurvy barons, risen from being flunkies, but why I don't know and I don't care. I am only a scoundrel of the pseudo-aristocratic society, and I am regarded as a charming polisson. My father is a wretched little general, and my mother was at one time received en haute lieu. With the help of the Jew Ziffel, I forged 50,000 ruble notes last year, and then I informed against him, while Julie Charpentier de Lusignan carried off the money to Bordeaux. And only fancy, I was engaged to be married to a girl still at school, 3 months under 16, with a dowry of 90,000. Avdotya Ignatyevna, do you remember how you seduced me 15 years ago, when I was a boy of 14 in the Cour de Page?
Ah, that's you, you rascal! Well, you are a godsend anyway, for here...
You were mistaken in suspecting your neighbor, the business gentleman, of unpleasant fragrance. I said nothing, but I laughed. The stench came from me. They had to bury me in a nailed-up coffin.
Ah, you horrid creature! Still, I am glad you are here. You can't imagine the lack of life and wit here.
Quite so, and I intend to start here something original. Your Excellency, I don't mean you, Pervoyedev. Your Excellency, the other one, Tarasevich, the Privy Councillor. Answer. I am Klinovich, who took you to Mademoiselle Fury in Lent. Do you hear?
I do, Klinovich, and I am delighted, and trust me.
I wouldn't trust you with a halfpenny, and I don't care. I simply want to kiss you, dear old man, but luckily I can't. Do you know, gentlemen, what this grandpare's little game was? He died 3 or 4 days ago, and would you believe it? He left a deficit of 400,000 government money from the Fund for Widows and Orphans. He was the sole person in control of it for some reason, so that his accounts were not audited for the last 8 years. I can fancy what long faces they all have now, and what they call him. It's a delectable thought, isn't it? I have been wondering for the last year how a wretched old man of 70, gouty and rheumatic, succeeded in preserving the physical energy for his debaucheries, and now the riddle is solved. Those widows and orphans, the very thought of them must have egged him on. I knew about it long ago. I was the only one who did know. It was Julie told me. And as soon as I discovered it, I attacked him in a friendly way at once in Easter week. Give me 25,000. If you don't, they'll look into your accounts tomorrow. And just fancy, he had only 13,000 left then, so it seems it was very apropos his dying now. Grandpère, do you hear?
Cher Klinovich, I quite agree with you, and there was no need for you to go into such details. Life is so full of suffering and torment, and so little to make up for it, that I wanted at last to be at rest, and so far as I can see, I hope to get all I can from here, too.
I bet that he has already sniffed Katich Berestov.
Who? What Katish?
There was a rapacious quiver in the old man's voice.
Aha! What Katish? Why, here on the left, 5 paces from me, and 10 from you. She has been here 5 days, and if only you knew, Grandpère, what a little wretch she is, of good family and breeding, and a monster, a regular monster. I did not introduce her to anyone there. I was the only one who knew her. Katich, answer!
Hee.
The girl responded with a jangling laugh, in which there was a note of something as sharp as the prick of a needle.
Hee.
And a little blonde?
The grandpère faltered, drawing out the syllables.
Hee.
I have long.
The old man faltered breathlessly.
Cherish the dream of a little fair thing of 15, and just in such surroundings.
Ha! The monster!
Cried Avdotya Ignatyevna.
Enough!
Klinovich decided.
I see there is excellent material. We shall soon arrange things better. The great thing is to spend the rest of our time cheerfully. But what time? Hey you, government clerk, Lebezietnikov or whatever it is. I hear that's your name. Semyon Yevseich Lebeziatnikov, lower court counselor at your service. Very, very, very much delighted to meet you.
I don't care whether you are delighted or not, but you seem to know everything here. Tell me first of all, how is it we can talk? I've been wondering ever since yesterday. We are dead, and yet we are talking and seem to be moving, and yet we are not talking and not moving. What jugglery is this?
If you want an explanation, Baron, Platon Nikolaevich could give you one better than I.
What Platon Nikolaevich is that? To the point. Don't beat about the bush.
Platon Nikolaevich is our homegrown philosopher, scientist, and master of arts. He has brought out several philosophical works, but for the last 3 months he has been getting quite drowsy, and there is no stirring him up now. Once a week he mutters something utterly irrelevant.
To the point, to the point.
He explains all this by the simplest fact, namely that when we were living on the surface, we mistakenly thought that there was death. The body revives, as it were. Here the remains of life are concentrated, but only in consciousness. I don't know how to express it, but life goes on, as it were, by inertia. In his opinion, everything is concentrated somewhere in consciousness, and goes on for 2 or 3 months, sometimes even for half a year. There is one here, for instance, who is almost completely decomposed, but once every 6 weeks he suddenly utters one word, quite senseless, of course, about some Bobok. Bobok, Bobok. But you see that an imperceptible speck of life is still warm within him.
It's rather stupid. Well, and how is it I have no sense of smell, and yet I feel there's a stench?
That? Well, on that point our philosopher is a bit foggy. It's apropos of smell, he said, that the stench one perceives here is, so to speak, moral. It's the stench of the soul, he says, that in these 2 or 3 months it may have time to recover itself, and this is, so to speak, the last mercy. Only I think, Baron, that these are mystic ravings, very excusable in his position.
Enough. All the rest of it, I am sure, is nonsense. The great thing is that we have 2 or 3 months more of life, and then... Bobok! I propose to spend these 2 months as agreeably as possible, and so to arrange everything on a new basis. Gentlemen, I propose to cast aside all shame.
Ah, let us cast aside all shame. Let us.
Many voices could be heard saying, and, strange to say, several new voices were audible which must have belonged to others newly awakened. The engineer, now fully awake, boomed out his agreement with peculiar delight. The girl, Katish, giggled gleefully.
Oh, how I long to cast off all shame!
Avdotya Ignatyevna exclaimed rapturously.
I say, if Avdotya Ignatyevna wants to cast off all shame...
No, Klinovich. I was ashamed up there all the same, but here I should like to cast off shame. I should like it awfully.
I understand, Klinovich,
boomed the engineer,
that you want to rearrange life here on new and rational principles.
Oh, I don't care a hang about that. For that, we'll wait for Kudayarov, who was brought here yesterday. When he wakes, he'll tell you all about it. He is such a personality, such a titanic personality. Tomorrow they'll bring along another natural scientist, I believe, an officer for certain, and 3 or 4 days later a journalist, and I believe his editor with him. But deuce take them all. There will be a little group of us anyway, and things will arrange themselves. Though meanwhile I don't want us to be telling lies. That's all I care about, for that is one thing that matters. One cannot exist on the surface without lying, for life and lying are synonymous. But here we will amuse ourselves by not lying. Hang it all, the grave has some value after all. We'll all tell our stories aloud,
and we won't be ashamed of anything. First of all, I'll tell you about myself. I am one of the predatory kind, you know. All that was bound and held in check by rotten cords up there on the surface. Away with cords, and let us spend these 2 months in shameless truthfulness. Let us strip and be naked.
Let us be naked.
Let us be naked,
cried all the voices.
I long to be naked. I long to be.
Avdotya Ignatyevna shrilled.
I see we shall have fun here. I don't want Eka after all.
No, I tell you, give me a taste of life.
Hee,
giggled Katish.
The great thing is that no one can interfere with us, and though I see Pervoyadev is in a temper, he can't reach me with his hand. Grandpère, do you agree?
I fully agree, fully, and with the utmost satisfaction, but on condition that Katish is the first to give us her biography. I protest with all my heart.
General Pervoyedov brought out firmly.
Your Excellency.
The scoundrel Bezietnikov persuaded him in a murmur of fussy excitement.
Your Excellency, it will be to our advantage to agree. Here, you see, there's this girl's, and all their little affairs.
There's the girl, it's true. But?
It's to our advantage, Your Excellency. Upon my word it is. If only as an experiment, let us try.
Even in the grave, they won't let us rest in peace.
In the first place, General, you were playing preference in the grave, and in the second, we don't care a hang about you.
Drawled Klinovich.
Sir, I beg you not to forget yourself.
What? Why, you can't get at me, and I can tease you from here as though you were Julie's lapdog. And another thing, gentlemen, how is he a general here? He was a general there, but here is mere refuse.
No, not mere refuse. Even here.
Here you will rot in the grave, and 6 brass buttons will be all that will be left of you.
Bravo! Klinovich! Ha 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 ha!
Roared voices.
I have served my sovereign. I have the sword.
Your sword is only fit to prick mice, and you never drew it even for that.
That makes no difference. I formed a part of the whole.
There are all sorts of parts in a whole.
Bravo, Klinovich, bravo! Ha ha ha!
I don't understand what the sword stands for,
boomed the engineer.
We shall run away from the Prussians like mice. They'll crush us to powder,
cried a voice in the distance that was unfamiliar to me, that was positively spluttering with glee.
The sword, sir, is an honor,
the general cried, but only I heard him. There arose a prolonged and furious roar, clamor and hubbub, and only the hysterically impatient squeals of Avdotya Ignatyevna were audible.
But do let us make haste. When are we going to begin to cast off all shame?
The soul does in truth pass through torments,
exclaimed the voice of the plebeian.
And
here I suddenly sneezed. It happened suddenly and unintentionally, but the effect was striking. All became as silent as one expects it to be in a churchyard. It all vanished like a dream. A real silence of the tomb set in. I don't believe they were ashamed on account of my presence. They had made up their minds to cast off all shame. I waited 5 minutes. Not a word. Not a sound. It cannot be supposed that they were afraid of my informing the police, for what could the police do to them? I must conclude that they had some secret unknown to the living, which they carefully concealed from every mortal. Well, my dears, I thought, I shall visit you again. And with those words I left the cemetery. No, that I cannot admit. No, I really cannot. The Bobok case does not trouble me, so that is what that Bobok signified. Depravity in such a place. Depravity of the last aspirations. Depravity of sodden and rotten corpses, and not even sparing the last moments of consciousness. Those moments have been granted, vouchsafed to them, and worst of all, in such a place. No, that I cannot admit. I shall go to other tombs. I shall listen everywhere. Certainly one ought to listen everywhere and not merely at one spot in order to form an idea. Perhaps one may come across something reassuring. But I shall certainly go back to those. They promise their biographies and anecdotes of all sorts. Tfu! But I shall go. I shall certainly go. It is a question of conscience. I shall take it to the Citizen. The editor there has had his portrait exhibited too. Maybe he will print it. End of Bobok by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 16 of Short Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. 1. I am a ridiculous person. Now they call me a madman. That would be a promotion if it were not that I remain as ridiculous in their eyes as before. But now I do not resent it. They are all dear to me now, even when they laugh at me, and, indeed, it is just then that they are particularly dear to me. I could join in their laughter, not exactly at myself, but through affection for them, if I did not feel so sad as I look at them. Sad because they do not know the truth, and I do know it. Oh, how hard it is to be the only one who knows the truth. But they won't understand that. No, they won't understand it. In the old days, I used to be miserable at seeming ridiculous. Not seeming, but being. I have always been ridiculous, and I have known it, perhaps, from the hour I was born. Perhaps from the time I was 7 years old, I knew I was ridiculous. Afterwards, I went to school, studied at the university, and, do you know, the more I learned, the more thoroughly I understood that I was ridiculous. So that it seemed in the end as though all the sciences I studied at the university existed only to prove and make evident to me as I went more deeply into them that I was ridiculous. It was the same with life as it was with science. With every year, the same consciousness of the ridiculous figure I cut in every relation grew and strengthened. Everyone always laughed at me, but not one of them knew or guessed that if there were one man on earth who knew better than anybody else that I was absurd, it was myself. And what I resented most of all was that they did not know that. But that was my own fault. I was so proud that nothing would have ever induced me to tell it to anyone. This pride grew in me with the years, and if it had happened that I allowed myself to confess to anyone that I was ridiculous, I believe that I should have blown out my brains the same evening. Oh, how I suffered in my early youth from the fear that I might give way and confess it to my schoolfellows. But since I grew to manhood, I have for some unknown reason become calmer, though I realized my awful characteristic more fully every year. I say unknown, for to this day I cannot tell why it was. Perhaps it was owing to the terrible misery that was growing in my soul, through something which was of more consequence than anything else about me. That something was the conviction that had come upon me that nothing in the world mattered. I had long had an inkling of it, but the full realization came last year, almost suddenly. I suddenly felt that it was all the same to me whether the world existed or whether there had never been anything at all. I began to feel with all my being that there was nothing existing. At first I fancied that many things had existed in the past, but afterwards I guessed that there never had been anything in the past either, but that it had only seemed so for some reason. Little by little I guessed that there would be nothing in the future either. Then I left off being angry with people, and almost ceased to notice them. Indeed, this showed itself even in the pettiest trifles. I used, for instance, to knock against people in the street, and not so much from being lost in thought. What had I to think about? I had almost given up thinking by that time. Nothing mattered to me. If at least I had solved my problems. Oh, I had not settled one of them, and how many there were. But I gave up caring about anything, and all the problems disappeared. And it was after that that I found the truth. I learnt the truth last November, on the 3rd of November to be precise, and I remember every instant since. It was a gloomy evening, one of the gloomiest possible evenings. I was going home at about 11 o'clock, and I remember that I thought that the evening could not be gloomier, even physically. Rain had been falling all day, and it had been a cold, gloomy, almost menacing rain, with, I remember, an unmistakable spite against mankind. Suddenly, between 10 and 11 it had stopped, and was followed by a horrible dampness, colder and damper than the rain, and a sort of steam was rising from everywhere, from every stone in the street, and from every by-lane, if one looked down it as far as one could. A thought suddenly occurred to me that if all the street lamps had been put out, it would have been less cheerless, that the gas made one's heart sadder because it lighted it all up. I had had scarcely any dinner that day, and had been spending the evening with an engineer, and 2 other friends had been there also. I sat silent. I fancy I bored them. They talked of something rousing, and suddenly they got excited over it. But they did not really care, I could see that, and only made a show of being excited. I suddenly said as much to them. "My friends," I said, "you really do not care one way or the other." They were not offended, but they all laughed at me. That was because I spoke without any note of reproach, simply because it did not matter to me. They saw it did not, and it amused them. As I was thinking about the gas lamps in the street, I looked up at the sky. The sky was horribly dark, but one could distinctly see tattered clouds, and between them, fathomless black patches. Suddenly I noticed in one of these patches a star, and began watching it intently. That was because that star gave me an idea. I decided to kill myself that night. I had firmly determined to do so 2 months before, and poor as I was, I bought a splendid revolver that very day and loaded it. But 2 months had passed, and it was still lying in my drawer. I was so utterly indifferent that I wanted to seize a moment when I would not be so indifferent. Why, I don't know. And so for 2 months, every night that I came home, I thought I would shoot myself. I kept waiting for the right moment, and so now this star gave me a thought. I made up my mind that it should certainly be that night. And why the star gave me the thought, I don't know. And just as I was looking at the sky, this little girl took me by the elbow. The street was empty, and there was scarcely anyone to be seen. A cabman was sleeping in the distance in his cab. It was a child of 8 with a kerchief on her head, wearing nothing but a wretched little dress all soaked with rain. But I noticed particularly her wet, broken shoes, and I recall them now. They caught my eye particularly. She suddenly pulled me by the elbow and called me. She was not weeping, but was spasmodically crying out some words which she could not utter properly, because she was shivering and shuddering all over. She was in terror about something, and kept crying, "Mammy, Mammy." I turned facing her. I did not say a word, and went on. But she ran, pulling at me, and there was that note in her voice which in frightened children means despair. I know that sound. Though she did not articulate the words, I understood that her mother was dying, or that something of the sort was happening to them, and that she had run out to call someone, to find something to help her mother. I did not go with her. On the contrary, I had an impulse to drive her away. I told her first to go to a policeman, but clasping her hands, she ran beside me, sobbing and gasping, and would not leave me. Then I stamped my foot and shouted at her. She called out, "Sir, sir," but suddenly abandoned me and rushed headlong across the road. Some other passerby appeared there, and she evidently flew from me to him. I mounted up to my 5th story. I have a room in a flat where there are other lodgers. My room is small and poor, with a garret window in the shape of a semicircle. I have a sofa covered with American leather, a table with books on it, 2 chairs, and a comfortable armchair, as old as can be, but of the good old-fashioned shape. I sat down, lighted the candle, and began thinking. In the room next to mine, through the partition wall, a perfect bedlam was going on. It had been going on for the last 3 days. A retired captain lived there, and he had half a dozen visitors, gentlemen of doubtful reputation, drinking vodka and playing stoss with old cards. The night before there had been a fight, and I know that 2 of them had been for a long time engaged in dragging each other about by the hair. The landlady wanted to complain, but she was in abject terror of the captain. There was only one other lodger in the flat, a thin little regimental lady, on a visit to Petersburg, with 3 little children who had been taken ill since they came into the lodgings. Both she and her children were in mortal fear of the captain, and lay trembling and crossing themselves all night, and the youngest child had a sort of fit from fright. That captain, I know for a fact, sometimes stops people in the Nevsky Prospect and begs. They won't take him into the service. But strange to say, that's why I'm telling this, all this month that the captain has been here, his behavior has caused me no annoyance. I have, of course, tried to avoid his acquaintance from the very beginning, and he, too, was bored with me from the first. But I never care how much they shout the other side of the partition, nor how many of them there are in there. I sit up all night and forget them so completely that I do not even hear them. I stay awake till daybreak, and have been going on like that for the last year. I sit up all night in my armchair at the table, doing nothing. I only read by day. I sit, don't even think. Ideas of a sort wander through my mind, and I let them come and go as they will. A whole candle is burnt every night. I sat down quietly at the table, took out the revolver, and put it down before me. When I had put it down, I asked myself, I remember, "Is that so?" and answered with complete conviction, "It is." That is, I shall shoot myself. I knew that I should shoot myself that night for certain, but how much longer I should go on sitting at the table, I did not know. And no doubt I should have shot myself if it had not been for that little girl. 2. You see, though nothing mattered to me, I could feel pain, for instance. If anyone had struck me, it would have hurt me. It was the same morally. If anything very pathetic happened, I should have felt pity just as I used to do in old days when there were things in life that did matter to me. I had felt pity that evening. I should have certainly helped a child. Why, then, had I not helped the little girl? Because of an idea that occurred to me at the time. When she was calling and pulling at me, a question suddenly arose before me, and I could not settle it. The question was an idle one, but I was vexed. I was vexed at the reflection that if I were going to make an end of myself that night, nothing in life ought to have mattered to me. Why was it that all at once I did not feel that nothing mattered, and was sorry for the little girl? I remember that I was very sorry for her, so much so that I felt a strange pang, quite incongruous in my position. Really, I do not know better how to convey my fleeting sensation at the moment, but the sensation persisted at home when I was sitting at the table, and I was very much irritated as I had not been for a long time past. One reflection followed another. I saw clearly that so long as I was still a human being and not nothingness, I was alive, and so could suffer, be angry, and feel shame at my actions. So be it. But if I'm going to kill myself in 2 hours, say, what is the little girl to me? And what have I to do with shame or with anything else in the world? I shall turn into nothing. Absolutely nothing. And can it really be true that the consciousness that I shall completely cease to exist immediately, and so everything else will cease to exist, does not in the least affect my feeling of pity for the child, nor the feeling of shame after a contemptible action? I stamped and shouted at the unhappy child, as though to say, not only I feel no pity, but even if I behave inhumanely and contemptibly, I am free to, for in another 2 hours, everything will be extinguished. Do you believe that that was why I shouted that? I am almost convinced of it now. It seemed clear to me that life and the world somehow depended upon me now. I may almost say that the world now seemed created for me alone. If I shot myself, the world would cease to be, at least for me. I say nothing of its being likely that nothing will exist for anyone when I am gone, and that as soon as my consciousness is extinguished, the whole world will vanish too, and become void like a phantom, as a mere appurtenance of my consciousness, for possibly all this world and all these people are only me, myself. I remember that, as I sat and reflected, I turned all these new questions that swarmed one after another quite the other way, and thought of something quite new. For instance, a strange reflection suddenly occurred to me, that if I had lived before on the moon or on Mars, and there had committed the most disgraceful and dishonorable action, and had there been put to such shame and ignominy as one can only conceive and realize in dreams, in nightmares, and if, finding myself afterwards on Earth, I were able to retain the memory of what I had done on the other planet, and at the same time knew that I should never, under any circumstances, return there, then, looking from the Earth to the moon, should I care or not? Should I feel shame for that action, or not? These were idle and superfluous questions, for the revolver was already lying before me, and I knew in every fiber of my being that it would happen for certain. But they excited me, and I raged. I could not die now without having first settled something. In short, the child had saved me, for I put off my pistol shot for the sake of these questions. Meanwhile, the clamor had begun to subside in the captain's room. They had finished their game, were settling down to sleep, and meanwhile were grumbling and languidly winding up their quarrels. At that point, I suddenly fell asleep in my chair at the table, a thing which had never happened to me before. I dropped asleep, quite unawares. Dreams, as we all know, are very queer things. Some parts are presented with appalling vividness, with details worked up with the elaborate finish of jewelry, while others one gallops through, as it were, without noticing them at all, as, for instance, through space and time. Dreams seem to be spurred on not by reason, but by desire, not by the head, but by the heart. And yet what complicated tricks my reason has played sometimes in dreams! What utterly incomprehensible things happen to it! My brother died 5 years ago, for instance. I sometimes dream of him. He takes part in my affairs, we are very much interested, and yet all through my dream I quite know and remember that my brother is dead and buried. How is it that I am not surprised that, though he is dead, he is here beside me and working with me? Why, it is that my reason fully accepts it? But enough. I will begin about my dream. Yes, I dreamed a dream, my dream of the 3rd of November. They tease me now, telling me it was only a dream. But does it matter whether it was a dream or reality, if the dream made known to me the truth? If once one has recognized the truth and seen it, you know that it is the truth, and that there is no other, and there cannot be, whether you are asleep or awake. let it be a dream, so be it. But the real life of which you make so much, I had meant to extinguish by suicide. And my dream, oh, it revealed to me a different life, renewed, grand, and full of power. Listen. 3. I have mentioned that I dropped to sleep unawares and even seemed to be still reflecting on the same subjects. I suddenly dreamt that I picked up the revolver and aimed it straight at my heart. My heart, and not my head, and I had determined beforehand to fire at my head, at my right temple. After aiming at my chest, I waited a second or two, and suddenly my candle, my table, and the wall in front of me began moving and heaving. I made haste to pull the trigger. In dreams, you sometimes fall from a height, or are stabbed, or beaten, but you never feel pain unless perhaps you really bruised yourself against the bedstead. Then you feel pain and almost always wake up from it. It was the same in my dream. I did not feel any pain, but it seemed as though, with my shot, everything within me was shaken, and everything was suddenly dimmed, and it grew horribly black around me. I seemed to be blinded and benumbed, and I was lying on something hard, stretched on my back. I saw nothing and could not make the slightest movement. People were walking and shouting around me. The captain bawled. The landlady shrieked, and suddenly another break, and I was being carried in a closed coffin. And I felt how the coffin was shaking and reflected upon it, and for the first time the idea struck me that I was dead. Utterly dead. I knew it, and had no doubt of it. I could neither see nor move, and yet I was feeling and reflecting. But I was soon reconciled to the position, and, as one usually does in a dream, accepted the facts without disputing them. And now I was buried in the earth. They all went away. I was left alone. Utterly alone. I did not move. Whenever before I had imagined being buried, the one sensation I associated with the grave was that of damp and cold. So now I felt that I was very cold, especially the tips of my toes, but I felt nothing else. I lay still. Strange to say, I expected nothing, accepting without dispute that a dead man had nothing to expect. But it was damp. I don't know how long a time passed, whether an hour or several days or many days, but all at once a drop of water fell on my closed left eye, making its way through a coffin lid. It was followed a minute later by a second, then a minute later by a third, and so on regularly every minute. There was a sudden glow of profound indignation in my heart, and I suddenly felt in it a pang of physical pain. That's my wound, I thought. That's the bullet. And drop after drop, every minute kept falling on my closed eyelid, and all at once, not with my voice, but with my whole being, I called upon the power that was responsible for all that was happening to me. Whoever you may be, if you exist, and if anything more rational than what is happening here is possible, suffer it to be here now. But if you are revenging yourself upon me for my senseless suicide by the hideousness and absurdity of this subsequent existence, then let me tell you that no torture could ever equal the contempt which I shall go on dumbly feeling, though my martyrdom may last 1,000,000 years. I made this appeal and held my peace. There was a full minute of unbroken silence, and again another drop fell. But I knew with infinite unshakable certainty that everything would change immediately. And behold, my grave suddenly was rent asunder. That is, I don't know whether it was opened or dug up, but I was caught up by some dark and unknown being, and we found ourselves in space. I suddenly regained my sight. It was the dead of night, and never had there been such darkness. We were flying through space far away from the earth. I did not question the being who was talking to me. I was proud and waited. I assured myself that I was not afraid and was thrilled with ecstasy at the thought that I was not afraid. I do not know how long we were flying. I cannot imagine. It happened as it always does in dreams when you skip over space and time, and the laws of thought and existence, and only pause upon the points for which the heart yearns. I remember that I suddenly saw in the darkness a star. Is that serious? I asked impulsively, though I had not meant to ask any questions. No, that is the star you saw between the clouds when you were coming home. The being who was carrying me replied. I knew that it had something like a human face. Strange to say, I did not like that being. In fact, I felt an intense aversion for it. I had expected complete non-existence, and that was why I had put a bullet through my heart. And here I was in the hands of a creature not human, of course, but yet living, existing. And so there is life beyond the grave. I thought with the strange frivolity one has in dreams, but in its inmost depth my heart remained unchanged. And if I have got to exist again, I thought, and live once more under the control of some irresistible power, I won't be vanquished and humiliated. You know that I am afraid of you and despise me for that, I said suddenly to my companion, unable to refrain from the humiliating question which implied a confession, and feeling my humiliation stab my heart as with a pin. He did not answer my question, but all at once I felt that he was not even despising me, but was laughing at me and had no compassion for me, and that our journey had an unknown and mysterious object that concerned me only. Fear was growing in my heart. Something was mutely and painfully communicated to me from my silent companion, and permeated my whole being. We were flying through dark, unknown space. I had for some time lost sight of the constellations familiar to my eyes. I knew that there were stars in the heavenly spaces, the light of which took thousands or millions of years to reach the earth. Perhaps we were already flying through those spaces. I expected something with a terrible anguish that tortured my heart, and suddenly I was thrilled by a familiar feeling that stirred me to the depths. I suddenly caught sight of our sun. I knew that it could not be our sun, that gave life to our earth, and that we were an infinite distance from our sun. But for some reason I knew in my whole being that it was a sun exactly like ours, a duplicate of it. A sweet, thrilling feeling resounded with ecstasy in my heart. The kindred power of the same light which had given me light stirred an echo in my heart and awakened it, and I had a sensation of life, the old life of the past, for the first time since I had been in the grave. But if that is the sun, if that is exactly the same as our sun, I cried, where is the earth? And my companion pointed to a star twinkling in the distance with an emerald light. We were flying straight toward it. And are such repetitions possible in the universe? Can that be the law of nature? And if that is an earth there, can it be just the same earth as ours, just the same, as poor as unhappy, but precious and beloved forever, arousing in the most ungrateful of her children the same poignant love for her that we feel for our earth? I cried out, shaken by irresistible ecstatic love for the old familiar earth which I had left. The image of the poor child whom I had repulsed flashed through my mind. You shall see it all, answered my companion, and there was a note of sorrow in his voice. But we were rapidly approaching the planet. It was growing before my eyes. I could already distinguish the ocean, the outline of Europe, and suddenly a feeling of a great and holy jealousy glowed in my heart. How can it be repeated? And what for? I love and can love only that earth which I have left stained with my blood, when in my ingratitude I quenched my life with a bullet in my heart. But I have never ceased to love that earth, and perhaps on the very night I parted from it I loved it more than ever. Is there suffering upon this new earth? On our earth we can only love with suffering and through suffering. We cannot love otherwise, and we know no other sort of love. I want suffering in order to love. I long, I thirst, this very instant to kiss with tears the earth that I have left, and I won't accept life on any other. But my companion had already left me. I suddenly, quite without noticing how, found myself on this other earth, in the bright light of a sunny day, fair as paradise. I believe I was standing on one of the islands that make up, on our globe, the Greek archipelago, or on the coast of the mainland facing that archipelago. Oh, everything was exactly as it is with us, only everything seemed to have a festive radiance, the splendor of some great holy triumph attained at last. The caressing sea, green as emerald, splashed softly upon the shore and kissed it with manifest, almost conscious love. The tall, lovely trees stood in all the glory of their blossom, and their innumerable leaves greeted me, I am certain, with their soft caressing rustle, and seemed to articulate words of love. The grass glowed with bright and fragrant flowers. Birds were flying in flocks in the air and perched fearlessly on my shoulders and arms, and joyfully struck me with their darling fluttering wings. And at last I saw and knew the people of this happy land. They came to me of themselves. They surrounded me, kissed me. The children of the sun. The children of their sun. Oh, how beautiful they were. Never had I seen on our own earth such beauty in mankind. Only perhaps in our children in their earliest years one might find some remote, faint reflection of this beauty. The eyes of these happy people shone with a clear brightness. Their faces were radiant with the light of reason and fullness of a serenity that comes of perfect understanding. But those faces were gay. In their words and voices there was a note of childlike joy. Oh, from the first moment, from the first glance at them, I understood it all. It was the earth untarnished by the fall. On it lived people who had not sinned. They lived just in such a paradise as that in which, according to all the legends of mankind, our first parents lived before they sinned. The only difference was that all this earth was the same paradise. These people, laughing joyfully, thronged round me and caressed me. They took me home with them, and each of them tried to reassure me. Oh, they asked me no questions, but they seemed, I fancied, to know everything without asking, and they wanted to make haste and smooth away the signs of suffering from my face. 4. And do you know what? Well, granted that it was only a dream, yet the sensation of the love of those innocent and beautiful people has remained with me forever, and I feel as though their love is still flowing out to me from over there. I have seen them myself, have known them and been convinced. I loved them. I suffered for them afterwards. Oh, I understood at once, even at the time, that in many things I could not understand them at all. As an up-to-date Russian progressive and contemptible Petersburger, it struck me as inexplicable that, knowing so much, they had, for instance, no science like ours. But I soon realized that their knowledge was gained and fostered by intuitions different from those of us on earth, and that their aspirations, too, were quite different. They desired nothing and were at peace. They did not aspire to knowledge of life as we aspire to understand it, because their lives were full. But their knowledge was higher and deeper than ours. For our science seeks to explain what life is, aspires to understand it in order to teach others how to live, while they, without science, knew how to live, and that I understood. but I could not understand their knowledge. They showed me their trees, and I could not understand the intense love with which they looked at them. It was as though they were talking with creatures like themselves. And perhaps I shall not be mistaken if I say that they conversed with them. Yes, they had found their language, and I am convinced that the trees understood them. They looked at all nature like that, at the animals who lived in peace with them and did not attack them but loved them, conquered by their love. They pointed to the stars and told me something about them which I could not understand, but I am convinced that they were somehow in touch with the stars, not only in thought but by some living channel. Oh, these people did not persist in trying to make me understand them. They loved me without that. But I knew that they would never understand me, and so I hardly spoke to them about our earth. I only kissed in their presence the earth on which they lived, and mutely worshipped them themselves. And they saw that, and let me worship them without being abashed at my adoration, for they themselves loved much. They were not unhappy on my account when at times I kissed their feet with tears, joyfully conscious of the love with which they would respond to mine. At times I asked myself with wonder how it was they were able never to offend a creature like me, and never once to arouse a feeling of jealousy or envy in me. Often I wondered how it could be that, boastful and untruthful as I was, I never talked to them of what I knew, of which, of course, they had no notion, that I was never tempted to do so by a desire to astonish, or even to benefit them. They were as gay and sportive as children. They wandered about their lovely woods and copses. They sang their lovely songs. Their fare was light, the fruits of their trees, the honey from their woods, and the milk of the animals who loved them. The work they did for food and raiment was brief and not laborious. They loved and begot children, but I never noticed in them the impulse of that cruel sensuality which overcomes almost every man on this earth, all and each, and is the source of almost every sin of mankind on earth. They rejoiced at the arrival of children as new beings to share their happiness. There was no quarreling, no jealousy among them, and they did not even know what the words meant. Their children were the children of all, for they all made up one family. There was scarcely any illness among them, though there was death. But their old people died peacefully, as though falling asleep, giving blessings and smiles to those who surrounded them to take their last farewell with bright and loving smiles. I never saw grief or tears on those occasions, but only love, which reached the point of ecstasy, but a calm ecstasy, made perfect and contemplative. One might think that they were still in contact with the departed after death, and that their earthly union was not cut short by death. They scarcely understood me when I questioned them about immortality, but evidently they were so convinced of it without reasoning that it was not for them a question at all. They had no temples, but they had a real, living, and uninterrupted sense of oneness with the whole of the universe. They had no creed, but they had a certain knowledge that when their earthly joy had reached the limits of earthly nature, then there would come for them, for the living and for the dead, a still greater fullness of contact with the whole of the universe. They looked forward to that moment with joy, but without haste, not pining for it, but seeming to have a foretaste of it in their hearts, of which they talked to one another. In the evening before going to sleep, they liked singing in musical and harmonious chorus. In those songs they expressed all the sensations that the parting day had given them, sang its glories and took leave of it. They sang the praises of nature, of the sea, of the woods. They liked making songs about one another and praised each other like children. They were the simplest songs, but they sprang from their hearts and went to one's heart. And not only in their songs, but in all their lives, they seemed to do nothing but admire one another. It was like being in love with each other, but an all-embracing, universal feeling. Some of their songs Solemn and rapturous, I scarcely understood it all. Though I understood the words, I could never fathom their full significance. It remained, as it were, beyond the grasp of my mind. Yet my heart unconsciously absorbed it more and more. I often told them that I had had a presentiment of it long before, that this joy and glory had come to me on our earth in the form of a yearning melancholy that at times approached insufferable sorrow, that I had had a foreknowledge of them all and of their glory in the dreams of my heart and the visions of my mind, that often on our earth I could not look at the setting sun without tears, that in my hatred for the men of our earth there was always a yearning anguish. Why could I not hate them without loving them? Why could I not help forgiving them? And in my love for them there was a yearning grief. Why could I not love them without hating them? They listened to me, and I saw they could not conceive what I was saying, but I did not regret that I had spoken to them of it. I knew that they understood the intensity of my yearning anguish over those whom I had left. But when they looked at me with their sweet eyes full of love, when I felt that in their presence my heart, too, became as innocent and just as theirs, the feeling of the fullness of life took my breath away, and I worshipped them in silence. Oh, everyone laughs in my face now and assures me that one cannot dream of such details as I am telling now, that I only dreamed or felt one sensation that arose in my heart in delirium and made up the details myself when I woke up. And when I told them that perhaps it really was so, my God, how they shouted with laughter in my face, and what mirth I caused! Yes, of course I was overcome by the mere sensation of my dream, and that was all that was preserved in my cruelly wounded heart. But the actual forms and images of my dreams, that is, the very ones I really saw at the very time of my dream, were filled with such harmony, were so lovely and enchanting, and were so actual, that on awakening I was of course incapable of clothing them in our poor language, so that they were bound to become blurred in my mind. And so perhaps I really was forced afterwards to make up the details, and so of course to distort them in my passionate desire to convey some, at least, of them as quickly as I could. But on the other hand, how can I help believing that it was all true? It was perhaps 1,000 times brighter, happier, and more joyful than I describe it. Granted that I dreamed it, yet it must have been real. You know, I will tell you a secret. Perhaps it was not a dream at all. For then something happened so awful, something so horribly true, that it could not have been imagined in my dream. My heart may have originated the dream, but would my heart alone have been capable of originating the awful event which happened to me afterwards? How could I alone have invented it, or imagined it in my dream? Could my petty heart and my fickle, trivial mind have risen to such a revelation of truth? Oh, judge for yourselves. Hitherto I have concealed it, but now I will tell the truth. The fact is that I corrupted them all. 5. Yes, it ended in my corrupting them all. How could it come to pass, I do not know, but I remember it clearly. The dream embraced thousands of years and left in me only a sense of the whole. I only know that I was the cause of their sin and downfall. Like a vile trichina, like a germ of the plague infecting whole kingdoms, so I contaminated all this earth, so happy and sinless before my coming. They learnt to lie, grew fond of lying, and discovered the charm of falsehood. Oh, at first perhaps it began innocently with a jest, coquetry, with amorous play, perhaps indeed with a germ, but that germ of falsity made its way into their hearts and pleased them. Then sensuality was soon begotten. Sensuality begot jealousy. Jealousy, cruelty. I don't know. I don't remember. But soon, very soon, the first blood was shed. They marveled and were horrified. and began to be split up and divided. They formed into unions, but it was against one another. Reproaches, upbraidings followed. They came to know shame, and shame brought them to virtue. The conception of honor sprang up, and every union began waving its flags. They began torturing animals, and the animals withdrew from them into the forest and became hostile to them. They began to struggle for separation, for isolation, for individuality, for mine and thine. They began to talk in different languages. They became acquainted with sorrow and loved sorrow. They thirsted for suffering and said that truth could only be attained through suffering. Then science appeared. As they became wicked, they began talking of brotherhood and humanitarianism and understood those ideas. As they became criminal, they invented justice and drew up whole legal codes in order to observe it and to ensure their being kept. Set up a guillotine. They hardly remembered what they had lost. In fact, refused to believe that they had ever been happy and innocent. They even laughed at the possibility of this happiness in the past and called it a dream. They could not even imagine it in definite form and shape, but strange and wonderful to relate, though they lost all faith in their past happiness and called it a legend, they so longed to be happy and innocent once more, that they succumbed to this desire like children, made an idol of it, set up temples and worshipped their own idea, their own desire, though at the same time they fully believed that it was unattainable and could not be realized, yet they bowed down to it and adored it with tears. Nevertheless, if it could have happened that they had returned to the innocent and happy condition which they had lost, and if someone had shown it to them again, and had asked them whether they wanted to go back to it, they would certainly have refused. They answered me, "We may be deceitful, wicked, and unjust. We know it, and weep over it. We grieve over it. We torment and punish ourselves, more, perhaps, than that merciful judge, who will judge us and whose name we know not. But we have science, and by means of it we shall find the truth, and we shall arrive at it consciously. Knowledge is higher than feeling. The consciousness of life is higher than life. Science will give us wisdom. Wisdom will reveal the laws, and the knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness." That is what they said. And after saying such things, everyone began to love himself better than anyone else. And indeed, they could not do otherwise. All became so jealous of the rights of their own personality that they did their very utmost to curtail and destroy them in others, and made that the chief thing in their lives. Slavery followed, even voluntary slavery. The weak eagerly submitted to the strong on condition that the latter aided them to subdue the still weaker. Then there were saints who came to these people weeping and talked to them of their pride, of their loss of harmony in due proportion, of their loss of shame. They were laughed at or pelted with stones. Holy blood was shed on the threshold of the temples. Then there arose men who began to think how to bring all people together again, so that everybody, while still loving himself best of all, might not interfere with others, and all might live together in something like a harmonious society. Regular wars sprang up over this idea. All the combatants at the same time firmly believed that science, wisdom, and the instinct of self-preservation would force men at last to unite into a harmonious and rational society, and so meanwhile, to hasten matters, the wise endeavored to exterminate as rapidly as possible all who were not wise, and did not understand their idea that the latter might not hinder its triumph. But the instinct of self-preservation grew rapidly weaker. There arose men, haughty and sensual, who demanded all or nothing. In order to obtain everything, they resorted to crime, and if they did not succeed, to suicide. There arose religions with a cult of non-existence and self-destruction for the sake of the everlasting peace of annihilation. At last these people grew weary of their meaningless toil, and signs of suffering came into their faces. And then they proclaimed that suffering was a beauty, for in suffering alone was their meaning. They glorified suffering in their songs. I moved about among them, wringing my hands and weeping over them. But I loved them perhaps more than in old days, when there was no suffering in their faces, and when they were innocent and so lovely. I loved the earth. They had polluted even more than when it had been a paradise, if only because sorrow had come to it. Alas, I always loved sorrow and tribulation, but only for myself. For myself. But I wept over them, pitying them. I stretched out my hands to them in despair, blaming, cursing, and despising myself. I told them that all this was my doing, mine alone, that it was I had brought them to corruption, contamination, and falsity. I besought them to crucify me. I taught them how to make a cross. I could not kill myself. I had not the strength, but I wanted to suffer at their hands. I yearned for their suffering. I longed that my blood should be drained to the last drop in these agonies. But they only laughed at me, and began at last to look upon me as crazy. They justified me. They declared that they had only got what they wanted themselves, and that all that now was could not have been otherwise. At last they declared to me that I was becoming dangerous, and that they should lock me up in a madhouse if I did not hold my tongue. Then such grief took possession of my soul that my heart was wrung, and I felt as though I were dying. And then I awoke. It was morning. That is, it was not yet daylight, but about 6 o'clock. I woke up in the same armchair. My candle had burnt out. Everyone was asleep in the captain's room, and there was a stillness all around, rare in our flat. First of all, I leapt up in great amazement. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, not even in the most trivial detail. I had never, for instance, fallen asleep like this in my armchair. While I was standing and coming to myself, I suddenly caught sight of my revolver laying loaded, ready. But instantly I thrust it away. Oh, now, life! I lifted up my hands and called upon eternal truth, not with words, but with tears. Ecstasy, immeasurable ecstasy, flooded my soul. Yes, life and spreading the good tidings. Oh, I at that moment resolved to spread the tidings, and resolved it, of course, for my whole life. I go to spread the tidings. I want to spread the tidings. Of what? Of the truth. For I have seen it with my own eyes, have seen it in all its glory. And since then I have been preaching. Moreover, I love all those who laugh at me more than any of the rest. Why that is so, I do not know and cannot explain, but so be it. I am told that I am vague and confused, and if I am vague and confused now, what shall I be later on? It is true indeed. I am vague and confused, and perhaps as time goes on I shall be more so. And of course I shall make many blunders before I find out how to preach, that is, find out what words to say, what things to do, for it is a very difficult task. I see all that as clear as daylight. But listen, who does not make mistakes? And yet you know, all are making for the same goal. All are striving in the same direction anyway, from the sage to the lowest robber, only by different roads. It is an old truth, but this is what is new. I cannot go far wrong, for I have seen the truth. I have seen and I know that people can be beautiful and happy without losing the power of living on earth. I will not and cannot believe that evil is the normal condition of mankind, and it is just this faith of mine that they laugh at. But how can I help believing it? I have seen the truth. It is not as though I had invented it with my mind. I have seen it, and the living image of it has filled my soul forever. I have seen it in such full perfection that I cannot believe that it is impossible for people to have it. And so, how can I go wrong? I shall make some slips, no doubt, and shall perhaps talk in second-hand language, but not for long. The living image of what I saw will always be with me, and will always correct and guide me. Oh, I am full of courage and freshness, and I will go on and on if it were for 1,000 years. Do you know, at first I meant to conceal the fact that I corrupted them, but that was a mistake. That was my first mistake. But truth whispered to me that I was lying, and preserved me and corrected me. But how establish paradise? I don't know, because I do not know how to put it into words. After my dream, I lost command of words. All the chief words, anyway, the most necessary ones. But never mind. I shall go, and I shall keep talking. I won't leave off, for anyway, I have seen it with my own eyes, though I cannot describe what I saw. But the scoffers do not understand that. It was a dream, they say. Delirium, hallucination, as though that meant so much. And they are so proud. A dream. What is a dream? And is not our life a dream? I will say more. Suppose that this paradise will never come to pass. That I understand. Yet I shall go on preaching it. And yet how simple it is. In one day, in 1 hour, everything could be arranged at once. The chief thing is to love others like yourself. That's the great thing, and that's everything. Nothing else is wanted. You will find out at once how to arrange it all. And yet it's an old truth which has been told and retold 1 billion times. But it has not formed part of our lives. The consciousness of life is higher than life. The knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness. That is what one must contend against, and I shall. If only everyone wants it, it can all be arranged at once. And I tracked out that little girl, and I shall go on and on. End of The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Reading by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. End of Short Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Thank you for listening.